Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to another in Chem Safety's online webinar series. And thanks to everyone that's joining us from level 4 lockdown. I'm now doing this from my spare room instead of the office, which is a bit different. If you are watching this webinar live, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen where you can post any questions, and I'll get to answer those at the end. And our details will also be on the follow-up email, which will include a link to the recording of today's session and some online resources for you as well. So today we'll be looking at location compliance certification and the common non-compliances that can often hold up the certification process. And you should hopefully come out of the webinar today with a better understanding of the things that are checked for compliance that often aren't correct or haven't been updated, and how you can avoid this from happening to you and your site in the future. So what is location compliance certification? So it's a bit like the warrant of fitness for your car. Essentially, it's a verification that the location that your hazardous substances are stored or used in is compliant at the time of inspection. The certificate can be issued for either 1 or 3 years, depending on the substances or classes that you've got present. And again, just like the WAF for your car, when it expires, the renewal process needs to check for the same things that were originally inspected, even if nothing's changed. Although you will find that there are some things that do need to be updated each year. And as for why we need them, it all comes down to keeping people safe. So if you've got more than the threshold amount for requiring a location compliance certificate, the controls that are required to be managed to obtain the certification are essentially there to protect people and property. So before we visit your site, we need to know a bit about what you've got. So what substances you have and how much, how many stores or locations they are kept in, and a bit about what you do on site. And the more information you can provide us with beforehand, the more likely everything will go smoothly. And once we've got these details, the certifier or someone that they've engaged to carry out inspections on their behalf, they'll visit your site and check various things, and the things they check will depend on the substances present and their quantities. And some of these things will be physical and others will be more paperwork based. There are some things that you'll need to update each year, so things like emergency response plan tests, training of new staff members or refreshers for existing staff, test of your fire extinguishers, some. And there's some other things that are more likely to stay the same year on year. So things like the fire rating of walls and doors, the secondary containment capacities, and the location of the store or the cage, whatever it is. Although you'll find out later that this isn't always the case. And once you meet all of the requirements for certification, you'll be issued with your certificate. And there's sometimes scope to issue what's called a conditional certificate when a site is not quite compliant, but the non-compliances are relatively minor and there aren't very many of them. In these conditional certificates, they can give you up to 3 months to complete the outstanding items before the full certificate is issued. So how can you help yourself to demonstrate compliance to your certifier? So like a lot of things these days, a paper trail is becoming more and more important. And this is especially relevant to location certification. So if there's something that can't be verified physically, like through a photo or documented evidence, is going to be required. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the requirements for certification are paperwork based. So these will need to be provided to your certifier, and the more detail, the better. So if you complete a test of your emergency response plan, don't just write down that you did it. Record who was there, what emergencies you covered, if you found anything that needed changing, and anything else that was discussed or brought up. And we'll go over more examples of the types of paperwork you'll need shortly. And once you've got your first certification, it's a good idea to make a folder of all the documents and evidence that went into the certification process so that it's all in one place and easy to update each year. And if you have the updated documents ready prior to the following inspections, it will make your certifier's day. They'll be very happy. And it's also not much help for you if the certifier has all your records, but you can't actually put your finger on them yourself. If in case at work, safe asks about them, you need to know where they are on your site. And also don't forget that completing all the requirements for certification and providing evidence of these, they are all PCBU duties. So the certifier is just there to check that you've done them. If you want more information on the duties of PCBUs, we've got another webinar that you can check out online that my colleague Janet presented. So now we'll start going through some of these non-compliances. It can be a bit frustrating all round if non-compliances need to be chased up each year. So one of the best things you can do for renewal of your certificate is to go through the previous year's report when preparing for your next inspection. And to do this, we'll first look at the common items that need addressing, so things like inventory and training records. And then following that, we'll look at what tends to come up over again for different classes of hazardous substances. So starting with inventories, these are one of the most common things that hold up certification, but thankfully they can also be one of the easiest things to fix. So inventories are required for your general compliance under the Health and Safety at Work hazardous substances regulations, and they become a certifiable item if you exceed the threshold for requiring an emergency response plan. The information that they need to contain it includes the product or substance name, the UN number, maximum quantity, the location, specific storage and segregation requirements, any hazardous waste you produce, and safety data sheets. Most often we will see sites that have an inventory, but it's just missing one or two of these required details. And most commonly it's the specific storage and segregation requirements that's missing. So you can find information on these specific storage and segregation requirements in the safety data sheets for your substances, particularly in sections 5 and 7. Another common thing we see is stock on hand records rather than maximum quantities. So under the regs, your inventory doesn't actually need to include your current stock on hand quantities, just the maximum quantity that you would have of that substance or class. So if you have a location that's getting certified, the quantity on your certificate will likely be that maximum quantity. Safety data sheets are also required as part of the inventory requirements. So you just need to make sure that they're New Zealand compliant and they're not out of date. I think some of my colleagues find it a bit scary then when they find safety data sheets older than some of us. And to help you with your inventory, WorkSafe have created an online calculator which can be used as an inventory. It generates a unique PIN number which only you will have access to, and you can download the inventory in several different formats, including things like a PDF or a controls report. And this controls report also has information on the controls that are triggered based on the substances and quantities you've entered. So essentially, if you fill in all the gaps that are provided, you'll have a compliant inventory. You may notice that hazard classifications aren't included on this list. They're not actually a requirement for your inventory, but they're certainly a very useful idea to include them. Training records. So with the regulation changes at the end of 2017, comprehensive training records have been something that lots of sites have struggled with. The regs require that all staff who handle, use, store, or manufacture hazardous substances are to be trained with regard to those substances. And like I mentioned earlier, the paper evidence of this is essential. So the content of the training is quite straightforward, and it can be done in-house, or alternatively, you can attend an external course like Chem Safety's Chemical Awareness course. Although just be aware that external courses can't actually cover all of the training requirements, as some of the requirements are site-specific, so they will need to be covered by you. Basically, what the training needs to cover is where your hazardous substances are on site, where your safety data sheets, emergency response plan, and other reference material is kept, what the hazards of your substances are, how to handle and store them safely, what PPE to wear and equipment to use, and how to wear or use it, what to do in the event of an emergency, and what a worker's obligations are under the regulations. And you also need to be able to demonstrate practical experience and competence for your staff. So for many sites, we find it isn't actually the fact that they haven't been trained, it's just that the details of what staff have been trained in isn't well documented, or that the records are missing some of these items. The most common items we find not covered in training records are worker obligations. And worker obligations are essentially the duties of workers under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the General Risk and Workplace Management Regulations. And these essentially say that workers must look after their own health and safety as well as that of others. They must comply with instructions and policies given to them by the employer, and that they must wear PPE that has been provided to them. And this kind of information is often found in perhaps a health and safety policy or an induction manual, or sometimes even in a staff contract. And for sites who have had or developed compliant training records in the past, when we go back to the site to renew their certificate, it's not uncommon to find that they've had new staff employed since the previous certification and that these staff haven't received the training. So one way to ensure that this doesn't happen is to include the training items in your induction to ensure that all new staff are captured. And it also helps to keep all of the training items in one document, because it can become quite complicated when each training item is covered in a separate document or policy, and it makes it hard to keep track of who has done what. Chem Safety have developed a checklist of all of the required training items, including a list of those worker obligations I just mentioned, to make it easy to ensure that your staff have been trained to the full extent required by the regs. And if you're interested, you can find this on our resource page of our website. And we suggest going through it to make sure that your staff or that your existing training processes cover all of the requirements and that you know how and where it's all documented. And another idea when reviewing your training records is to do a usability test. So essentially asking yourself some questions. So things like, can you easily tell from your records what training they've done, who's completed a certain module, who needs to do some refresher training, who is competent to undertake a task or to train new staff in that task. So if you can answer these questions, then it's likely that you've got really good training records. If you can't, you might like to think about how you are recording these details so that you can answer them. So moving on to emergency response plans. These are only required by the hazardous substances regulations and therefore for certification when the threshold is exceeded, although emergency planning is required by the general risk and workplace management regs, regardless of the substances and quantities that you've got on site. Flip charts, like the one that's in the picture on the screen there, these can be purchased or downloaded, and they're great for covering simple sites or for basic reference. But in some cases, if you do exceed the threshold for emergency response, you will need something that's a little bit more specific to your site and covering in more detail the scenarios and responses that you might need to take. And when a certifier assesses an emergency response plan for compliance, we have to consider the content of the plan and if it contains all of the correct and required information. But we also need to check to see if it's been submitted to Fire and Emergency New Zealand or FENZ for review and when it was last tested. So to be compliant, you need to submit a copy of your emergency plan, and this includes your inventory and site plan as well, to FENZ to give them the opportunity to review your plan and their part in it. This is very easy to do, and it's just done via email and by filling in a one-page document with your company and contact details. Regarding testing your plan, the regs require that you test your plan at least once every year or within 3 months of the plan changing or there being a change in personnel. And you can do this test as a tabletop exercise, or you might choose to do it as a walkthrough scenario or create your own scenario. The method of testing doesn't matter, but you do need to ensure that the test covers all foreseeable emergencies with regard to your hazardous substances. So for example, if you've got flammable liquids on site, you'll need to test your plan with regard to a fire involving flammable liquids and a spill of flammable liquids. If you also have LPG on site, you'll need to cover what to do in the event of a gas leak as well. And if your response to a fire involving LPG is different to that for one involving flammable liquids, you'll need to test that as well. For things like toxic and corrosive substances, you'll need to cover what to do in the event of exposure or contact with the substance, including first aid. And emergency response plan tests, these get checked at every certification, and these are often something that haven't been completed since the previous certification. So if you schedule your test for before your certifier comes to inspect your site to renew your certificate, again, you'll make them very happy if you can provide them with details of the test before they get there. And just another note, your emergency response plan, it isn't a do once and leave document. The tests you do, they'll help you fill in the details needed in a good review cycle. So always be considering the question, what if, and then what do we do, until you've considered everything that can go wrong, and be confident that once the plan has been followed, you're good to go again. And we've also got some more resources on our website that can help you with recording the details of your tests, and also a checklist for the content of what your plan is required to cover. Moving on to site plans now. So the minimum information required on a site plan to be compliant for your certification, it varies depending on the classes of substances that you've got. And I just want to point out that the picture in the plan here is an example of what we're trying to avoid, not aim for. And while the regs don't require that you use a qualified draftsperson or drafting software to produce it, the site plan must be, and I'm quoting from the regs here, accurate and drawn to scale to the extent necessary to enable the plan to meet its purpose, in particular by enabling a person inspecting the plan to identify actual distances and other relevant dimensions. So essentially it's saying that your site plan must be to scale. And if you've got a scale plan of your site with the property boundary and buildings shown, you've got a great base to add the extra details onto. And often a combination of a site overview plan, so for example, something from a council mapping systems website, and then a detailed plan of each location works best. So for large sites or sites with multiple locations, a set of plans will likely be needed so that you can get that detail on, not on a big plan. And when you're making a site plan, think about the purpose of your plan. It's better to have these multiple plans that cover different aspects of the site than to try and include too much information on one document. In terms of non-compliances in site plans, we frequently find any or all of these required elements missing from a site plan. So when looking at your site, consider you were someone new to the site, so a certifier, an inspector, a firefighter, and is it clear where the hazardous substances are? In the detailed plan, can you tell where the separation distances or hazardous areas go in relation to your protected places or ignition sources on site? That's kind of questions you might want to ask yourself to make sure that your plan is showing all of the information correctly. You may also be able to get good drawings from building records for your site, although in some cases you might need to adapt these and remove some extra details to make them a bit more legible sometimes. And there's also a lot of other information that you can include on your site plan. We've got another information sheet on our website which goes into detail of some of these. So fire rating is another thing that's required in some instances. So for example, larger quantities of LPG and for some flammable liquid stores and workrooms. And intervening walls and stores for class 4, 5, 6, and 8 can also need specific fire ratings. So where this is the case, you need to provide evidence to your certifier that the structures meet the required fire rating. So this could be, for example, a fire rated cladding system. So in which case we'd need confirmation that that cladding system has been installed to the manufacturer's specification to achieve the specified rating. Producer statements, these can relate to the construction that was completed to the design that was approved. We can also have as-built building plans that outline the fire ratings of certain structures or walls. And if you don't have any of these documents, you can't get construction records or older constructions, for example, a fire engineer's report to assess the construction would be appropriate and in that case necessary. And as the fire rating depends on matters that aren't readily visible, so like reinforcing and infill for concrete walls, again, the paper trail and documented evidence is essential. So if you've had something built recently, ensure that you get copies of the final documentation, because we often see records related to what was planned or proposed to be built, but not the confirmation of what actually ended up happening. And another wee catch in the regulations is that the thickness of concrete walls is deemed to be a means of compliance, but only in relation to class 4 and 5, not for class 3. And if you'd like some more information on this fire rating topic, earlier in the year, my colleague Janet prepared a white paper that goes into a bit more detail, and this is also available on our website if you'd like to read it. Fire extinguishers now. So again, these are one of the more easily remedied non-compliances. We often see them expired or poorly located with regard to the hazardous substance location and sometimes not the correct rating. Before the regulation change in December 2017, the requirement with regard to location of fire extinguishers was that they needed to be located within 30 metres of your hazardous substance location. But now they need to be clearly visible and readily accessible from your location. So essentially, you need to be able to more or less see them from the hazardous substance location, and they need to be accessible. So don't store things in front of them. In terms of rating, they need to meet a 30B rating, And this is most easily achieved by a dry powder extinguisher, although you can get foam extinguishers which also achieve this rating. The regs don't specify the type of extinguisher you have or you need to have, just that it's rated 30B. And you also need to make sure that the extinguishers have been tested each year and that the yellow tags have been clipped. So if you add an extra extinguisher one year, make sure it gets added to the list for testing next year so it doesn't get missed. Signage is another non-compliance that's pretty easily fixed. So things that often make a sign non-compliant is if it's faded and needed replacing, or if the content is too small. When the regulations changed, the word "has-chem" became a required element on signage, and this was often missing early after the reg changes, although this is a bit less common now. In terms of sizing, all elements on the sign need to be able to be read from at least 10 meters away. And WorkSafe have released guidance with regard to letter sizes, and they recommend a letter height of 50 millimeters for capital letters and 40 millimeters for lowercase letters. This is quite large and shows that an A4 sign just isn't going to quite cut it. It's not going to be big enough. And keep in mind that we're always happy to look at a signage proof before you send it to the printers for the go ahead, so that we can always double check that before you officially order it. So another thing for class 5, 6, and 8, there are some documentation requirements relating to operating procedures and things like equipment use and maintenance, PPE use, and prevention of accumulation of oxidizing substances and incompatible materials. So in relation to class 5, there's some simple statements that can be added to your existing procedures if you've got them. If you've got written information that clearly identifies what PPE is used, so that's both required and optional, and how you've ascertained that it's suitable. So for example, what type and how often it needs replacing, this would be amazing. Assessing the suitability of the PPE does start to get out of the realm of the LCC inspection, because we're generally inspecting storage locations where PPE is not required, so more closed containers rather than used. Similarly, for equipment that is specifically used to handle the substance, document what the equipment is and what the basic operating procedures are. So stop, go, what to do if something goes wrong, and where to find the manuals. And this will depend on the nature of equipment and how much detail you need to go into. We certainly don't expect to see much for a bucket and funnel type setup. Aside from this, we can't really tell you exactly what to put in your procedures, as you guys are the ones that know what's happening on your site the best and with your substances. But having good training procedures, good standard operating procedures, can help you with your training records and training procedures, as you can document that the workers are competent in the procedures that relate to your hazardous substances. Some other things that we see that often cause non-compliances for certification include coming to site and seeing that the store has been moved since the previous certification. So just a note that relocating a store does invalidate a certificate, and a new inspection would be required if you do need to move it. In the worst case scenario, it gets moved to a non-compliant location and would need to be moved again. So if you do need to move your store, contact your certifier beforehand to make sure it gets moved to another compliant location. You do get another certificate. Another common change that we see is increases in quantity, and this can have a lot of flow-on effects. Some of these are you might not no longer have enough containment capacity in your bund. Your separation distances will have likely increased and they may no longer be compliant. And you're also not permitted to have more than your notified quantity at the location, so another notification to WorkSafe would need to be submitted. Introducing different classes of substances can result in some incompatibility issues and may require additional certification. And also just in general housekeeping issues, so things like storage of plant and equipment, retention of substances or containers that need to be disposed of. And you need to keep in mind that the clear areas around a store, they're there for a reason. So even if there are empty containers, they need to be kept in your store as well. And empty containers do get counted as full unless they've been triple rinsed. If you've got an exemption, you need to be mindful of the conditions on it so that you don't invalidate it. So if you do invalidate your exemption, you may need to apply for another one. And in the case of having a pre-2017 exemption, this will introduce an expiry process that you might not have had on your existing exemption. So just have a look before you make any changes to make sure you're not invalidating that. So essentially how to avoid all of these non-compliances here is to think about changes that you need to make before you actually make them. And you may have a management of change process to follow that could identify these issues before they happen. And you can also call your certifier to ask for help, obviously. So now we'll briefly go over some of the different classes of substances and which of these non-compliances seem to be the most common for that class of substance. So starting with LPG, often for sites with LPG, it's the only hazardous substance of any significance on site. And because of this, the documentation and paperwork side of things is commonly lacking. Security of fire extinguishers is often a concern, particularly for sites that are open to the public, such as restaurants and cafes, but there still does need to be one readily accessible. So if it isn't clearly visible from the location due to security reasons, make sure that they've got notices or signage present that identifies where that fire extinguisher is located. Emergency response plan is only required if there's more than 300 kilos of LPG. And in this case, the flip chart is generally okay. So just make sure you know where the emergency shut-off locations are and include these in your plan. Moving on to flammable liquids. The location of the store and managing the separation distance to protected places is often one of the biggest issues. If it's possible to get your flammable liquids in smaller container sizes, this can sometimes help to reduce the separation distance in some cases, as well as reducing your quantity and perhaps ordering on a more frequent basis. This might reduce the distance as well. Testing your emergency response plan with regard to fires and spills is almost always not completed before the renewal inspection. So we recommend that once you've done one, book the next one in your calendar so that it's completed before the certifier comes out the following year. So it's all good to go again. And records relating to the fire rating of your walls and things are also essential for class 3s. So if you don't have them now, start putting them together well before the next inspection, so it's not something that could potentially hold you up. For toxic and corrosive substances, so location certification for these classes is relatively new, since December 2019. So not realizing that you might need a certificate for these substances still seems to be quite common. Separation distances also seem to be an issue here, particularly for class 6 more than class 8. So having space on site is definitely a major bonus if you're storing hazardous substances. There are some amendments in the pipeline. It's a very long pipeline, and that these will help some situations. We're waiting for the final release of these, so talk to us if you think these might apply to help you. And we also find that when testing emergency response plans, when you're testing them, what to do when someone is exposed to a toxic or corrosive substance and the resulting first aid actions, these are often missed. So take the time to think about all the possible things that could go wrong and ensure that you cover them all when you do your test. One other thing is having a water supply nearby for personal hygiene. Seems to be missed in a lot of cases. So for sites that don't have plumbing near the location, we have seen some pretty cool portable solutions which work really well. So it hopefully should be a relatively simple fix. So in summary, the best way to avoid non-compliances is to understand what your PCPD duties are. The LCC inspection is only checking the things that you already need to have in place. So the certifier isn't making you do things, it's the regs that are. Get ready for your next inspection by reading your previous report and making sure everything is either still the same or you've updated the relevant documents and got information ready. Test your emergency response plan as part of your own health and safety processes, not just because your LCC is due. Ensure that your inductions cover the basic hazardous substances training items so that new staff are captured right from the get-go. And talk to us before making any significant changes so that it doesn't cause further issues down the track. We don't want any exemptions invalidated. We've got some further resources to help you. The WorkSafe website has links to information and various quick guides on lots of hazardous substances topics. That's very useful. Our website also has various information sheets and templates that you can download. I mentioned some of those earlier. And again, like I said, this webinar will be available along with our previous ones on our YouTube channel. So moving on to questions. I'll figure out how to find them. Okay, so someone's asked a question around inventories. Did you say that the chemical you're bringing on site to use doesn't need to be in this, only the ones that are being stored in the container? It's just a lot of chemicals are stored to use on construction site, but some are used daily and some later, just to be good to get clarity around this for subbies and contractors. So the substances in your inventory will be, they should be all of those substances, even the ones that are just there for a small amount of time, because it's the maximum quantity that you would likely have on site. So one day you could have 0 and that's absolutely fine, but just make sure that it is, all those substances are there. Just if you're going to have them at some point or other, they should be on your inventory. So I hope that helps. Where's another question? Where is the guidance for sizes? Couldn't find a release version of this. I'm assuming that's the letter sizes for signage you're meaning. I will make sure that that gets included in the email that Chrissy sends around afterwards. I'll find the link for that for you. Don't think there's any more questions. So, do we have the printed copy of inventory on site? Electronic copy is absolutely fine. Yep, if you've got a printed copy, it is handy to have a printed copy that you could take outside with you in the event of an emergency to give to friends, but electronic copy is sufficient if that is all you have. Another one. What level of inventory is required for a safety data sheet? So if there's a single can of something, does it need a safety data sheet? Yeah, technically you should have safety data sheets for all of your products, unless it's something you've got in like a sort of household quantity, what you sort of have around your home. If it's that sort of quantity, then no, you don't need to include it on your inventory or have a safety data sheet for it. So yeah, in that case, perhaps a single can doesn't warrant being on your safety data on your inventory. Another one. Is it not optional to submit emergency response plans to FENS for review? So if you exceed the threshold for requiring an emergency response plan as part of your certification, you will need to submit it to FENS for review. That is a requirement, but it is the requirement for certification is just that you submit it. So we don't need to wait for FENS's response to that. We just need to see that you have submitted it. How often do we test the emergency response plan? So that would be at least once every year, so every 12 months, except if you've made changes to your plan or to personnel, then you'd need to test it within 3 months of that change. Are condensed safety data sheets sufficient to produce for the certifier? I mean, condensed safety data sheets, you can have them on site for your staff and things, but we'll still need to see that you've got the full safety data sheets as well. Another question here. In terms of quantities, sometimes it can be hard to get exact quantities if they're being used daily and more are being replenished and brought on. What's the best way to manage this on the inventory, as it could change daily? So again, this the inventory should be the maximum quantity that you would likely have. So if it's a substance that you're not being certified for, so you're not going to have a certificate for a maximum quantity, I would just, as best as you can, estimate what is the maximum you would have at one time, and then use that quantity. And if you're below it, well, that's absolutely fine. It's just you want to be, what would your maximum be? What is the requirement for access to safety data sheets? Do they need to be hard copy on site? No, they don't necessarily need to be hard copies, but staff do need to have access to them. So if you've got them electronically, you need to make sure that all your staff members are able to access those, be it on their, I don't know, phones, tablets, computers, whatever they've got. If they're In vehicles, it's probably a good idea to have hard copies, unless you can obviously access them on some sort of device. Another one, hard to capture inventory when lots of departments order chemicals. Is there an easy way to manage this? Not really. That is hard. I don't really have a good answer for that. I know some people, some sites with lots of departments ordering chemicals create a sort of master list that you can order off, like only ordering from certain suppliers and things like that, as a way to sort of track it, as opposed to everyone sort of having free range to order whatever they'd like. So maybe, I know that has certainly helped some sites in the past, but I know that's a tricky one. Do we have an example emergency response scenario available for specific situations as guidance? I don't know if we actually have something like that actually written down, perhaps. I mean, things like the flip chart and annual plan, technically, they go through a whole lot of scenarios in them. So essentially your test could be going through all of the scenarios that's given in the flip chart, if you've got that, or your plan. If I find anything else, I'll make sure I include it in the follow-up email, but not off the top of my head. Cool. I think that's all of the questions that I can see at the moment. So we might just call that quits. Thanks everyone for listening, and there'll be a follow-up email coming around with a link to the recording and the resources, and I will find that letter size reference material for you as well. Thanks everyone.